Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty wild. The Washington Post, publication known for like taking a stance,
Hmm.
has decided they're not endorsing any white presidential candidate this election, or any future ones either.
Yeah, it's really something. The Post has endorsed Democrats for president pretty consistently, going all the way back to like
Right.
1976.
Only one time they didn't was in 1988, so this is definitely a big change. And of course, we've got this CNBC article from October 25th, 2024 that lays out the controversy. What do you think is the most surprising thing here?
Hmm. Well, for me, it's got to be the timing. It's a super tight race right now, and newspapers historically, you know, they've used their endorsements to try and sway voters, especially in close elections like this. So for the Post to go silent now, it's a huge shift.
Yeah, it really is. And we can't really talk about the Washington Post without talking about,
Yeah.
Jeff Bezos, the owner. His relationship with Trump hasn't exactly been friendly.
You can say that again. The article goes into a lot of Trump's criticisms of Bezos in the Post. Then there's that lawsuit from Amazon saying Trump cost them a $10 billion contract with the Pentagon just because he had it out for Bezos.
So you have to wonder, is all that bad blood a factor here?
Oh, it's definitely possible. And the article adds a whole other layer to this, too. Apparently, the staff at the Post had written up an endorsement for Kamala Harris.
Wait, so they were going to endorse her?
That's what the article's sources are saying, but then Bezos personally stepped in and stopped it.
Wow, that's a pretty big intervention. So what's the Post officially saying about all this?
Well, the publisher, Will Levis, is saying it's about going back to their roots, not endorsing candidates, to stay independent.
Okay, but the article points out that Lewis is using quotes from way back, like the 1960s and 1972, to explain this. Kind of seems like they're trying to rewrite history a little bit, don't you think?
It does feel like they're picking and choosing what parts of history to use, like maybe to justify a decision that was really made for other reasons. And people aren't buying it either. There's been a ton of backlash.
Yeah, the article even said one of their columnists quit over it. And get this, there were over 10,000 comments on Lewis's explanation. A lot of people were furious, even canceling their subscriptions. It seemed like the Post really upset a lot of their readers.
And it's not just the readers. Marty Barron, who used to be an editor at the Post, he called it cowardice. And the Washington Post Guild, their staff union, they said they're worried about management interfering.
So we've got pushback from every direction: readers, former staff, even current staff.
Yeah, this decision really hit a nerve. And it's not just happening at the Post either. The article talks about something similar at the Los Angeles Times, where the head of the editorial board quit because the owner wouldn't let them endorse anyone.
So it seems like there's a pattern here. These billionaire owners calling the shots, even on something as basic as endorsing a candidate.
Yeah, and that brings up some big questions about who controls the media, whether they're really independent, and how much influence endorsements even have these days.
It makes you think, are these billionaires putting their own interests ahead of good journalism? And it's not just a theory either. Remember that time Bezos and Trump were all buddy-buddy after that assassination attempt on Trump back in July? And then just recently, Trump met with some execs from Blue Origin, Bezos' space company.
It does make you wonder if they're trying to be friends again. Maybe Bezos is hoping to smooth things over with Trump, maybe to help his businesses.
Yeah, especially if he thinks getting on Trump's good side will give him an advantage. Trump's pretty famous for rewarding his friends and punishing his enemies. So being friends with Trump could be a smart move for Bezos business-wise.
It really adds a whole new layer to the story, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah, it makes you think about like the bigger picture here. If a paper like the Washington Post, one that's always been so outspoken, if they're not endorsing anyone anymore, what does that mean for how we talk about politics these days?
Yeah, I mean, are endorsements even a thing anymore? With social media and everyone already so dug into their own side, you could argue that endorsements just make things even more divided.
That's a good point. But you could also say that endorsements still matter to some people, like those who haven't decided yet or who aren't really following the race closely. Historically, newspapers played a huge role in informing the public and shaping how people thought about politics.
So are you saying that by not endorsing, the Post is losing some of its power, like its ability to influence the conversation?
Exactly. And what's even more worrying is that this could scare other publications. If the Washington Post, with all its money and reputation, feels like it has to stay quiet, what about smaller news outlets that are more vulnerable?
It's kind of scary to think about, especially now when it's so hard to know what information to trust. And the fact that they made this decision just weeks before the election, it makes you wonder about Bezos' motives even more.
Yeah, the timing is suspicious. Makes you wonder if it's connected to those recent times Bezos and Trump have been seen together. Is it real change of heart or just a strategy?
It's hard to know for sure. Maybe Bezos figured out that fighting with the president wasn't good for him, especially with so much on the line. He's got Amazon, Blue Origin, all those other businesses. They could all be hurt if the administration is against him.
Right, so maybe this is just him trying to calm things down and protect his businesses?
But it could also be that he's trying to get on Trump's good side. Trump is known for helping his friends and hurting his enemies. So for Bezos, aligning with Trump could actually be a good business move.
We're left with a lot of questions. But one thing's for sure, this whole thing shows how fragile our media system is. We got to pay attention to how much influence these rich owners have over the news we get.
Totally. And it brings up a really fundamental question about journalism. Can we trust publications to make decisions that are good for the public, when those decisions could affect how much money their owner makes
Yeah.
or their relationships?
It's a question we have to keep asking. And as people who read and watch the news, we have to be smart about it. We can't just believe everything we see and hear, especially when it comes from sources owned by people with strong political connections.
So how do we figure out what's true in this crazy media world? How do we make sure we're getting information that's accurate and fair?
It starts with understanding that nothing is perfectly unbiased. Every source has its own slant, whether they realize it or not. That's why it's so important to get your news from lots of different places.
So not just sticking to one paper or one news channel.
Exactly. You got to see different points of view, even ones you might not agree with. And you got to be critical of everything you read and hear. Don't just accept things blindly.
Do your own research. Check different sources. Be willing to question even what you already believe.
Exactly. You got to be an active part of getting informed, not just sitting back and letting things wash over you.
So maybe this whole mess with the Washington Post could be a good lesson for us.
It definitely reminds us to be careful to think about the motives behind the news and to demand better from the people and companies giving us the news.
It also reminds us how important a free press is to a democracy.
And how important it is to support news organizations that value truth over profit.
Well said. So what about the Washington Post and their readers? Where'd they go from here?
Tough question. They've definitely taken a hit to their reputation. It'll be interesting to see if they can win back the trust of their audience.
Will they stick with this no endorsement policy? Or will they change their minds eventually?
Only time will tell. But this whole controversy has forced us to talk about who owns the media and how that affects what gets reported. And I think that's a good thing.
I agree. So we've covered a lot today. What are some big takeaways you want our listener to remember?
The biggest one is to remember that there's always a tension between making money and doing good journalism, especially when you're talking about who owns the media. This whole thing with Bezos and the Washington Post is a perfect example of how those two things can clash, and sometimes it hurts everyone.
Right. And it shows how important it is to be a smart news consumer. We have to understand the biases and agendas that might be hidden even in sources we trust.
Exactly. And I think it also reminds us that we're not just along for the ride when it comes to the news. We have a responsibility to think critically, question what we're told, and look for different perspectives.
And finally, this whole situation makes us wonder about the future of endorsements. Are they still relevant these days? Do they actually change anyone's mind? Or are they just adding to the noise of an already chaotic political world? It makes you wonder if endorsements even matter anymore, when there's so much information out there.
Yeah, it's a good question. Back in the day, a newspaper's endorsement could really make a difference for a candidate. But now, with everyone having their own opinions and getting their news from all over the place, it's harder to say if endorsements have the same power.
So if the Washington Post is backing away from endorsements, what does that even mean for how we talk about politics? How can voters get the information they need to decide who to vote for?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, about being smart about the news we consume. We have to be able to look at information critically, no matter where it comes from.
So it's about going deeper than just headlines and sound bites, right? Really understanding the issues, seeing different sides of the story, not just accepting what we see or hear at face value.
Exactly. It's about being involved in the process of getting informed, not just sitting back and letting the news wash over us. We need to understand the biases and agendas that might be behind the news, and we need to be willing to do our own research to figure out what's true.
I think that's a really important point for our listener. This whole thing with the Washington Post shows us that we can't just assume that the information we're getting is unbiased or the whole story. We have to be skeptical, ask questions, and think for ourselves.
Yeah, it's also a reminder of how important a free press is, especially in a democracy. We need to support news organizations that put truth and honesty first and hold the powerful accountable.
Because at the end of the day, A democracy works best when people are informed and engaged. And that means we all need to be critical thinkers, people who challenge the status quo and search for the truth.
Well said. I think that's a great way to wrap things up.
It really is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.